Yeah, can you hear me?
That's better.
See
Yep.
one?
No, there's still some feedback.
Yeah, you got to mute one of them.
Yeah, I see that. Hold on. Oh, geez.
I feel like I'm at a concert.
There we go. That's better. Okay, so we're now streaming live on YouTube. Don is not here yet, but hopefully will be. With that, I'd like to call this meeting of the Shelton Charter Revision Commission to order. Please rise for the pledge. Pledge allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America
and to the
republic which it stands,
nation,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, and as we say at the beginning of every meeting, we are operating under Governor Lamont's Executive Order 7, allowing us to do virtual meetings so long as they are available both live and recorded. And so we are streaming live on YouTube right now. It will be available afterwards, both on our YouTube channel and the city's YouTube channel. So with that, tonight, a couple things for us to do. I have completed the analysis of other towns when it comes to the major boards. And tonight we're going to tackle some of our thornier issues with the Board of Aldermen, Board of Education, and Board of Planning and Zoning. Same rules as always apply, which is if we are not unanimous, then we'll consider it an open item. Tonight, there's a higher probability of that, given the nature of the issue that we're dealing with. So with that, before we get into some of those issues, let me share my screen. I spoke with John Anglace about one issue that we had questions on before we get to other items. And it was this one here at the top, where we had said, you know, the charter allows for some appointments onto appointed boards by the mayor and some by the Board of Aldermen. In every single charter that I looked at, all of them had a check and a balance between their chief executive and their legislative. And when I asked John, is there a reason that we have this? He said, I know of no reason. And in fact, he said, it seems like that's the way you would do it, with the executive appointing and the legislature approving. So again, we had said, hey, this was a good idea unless there's any logic why not do it. And given the fact that neither the mayor nor John nor anyone else had any logic to it, given the fact that every other town that I've looked at least does it that way, I would propose we move this to the accept column.
I agree.
I agree.
Me too.
Okay.
Yes.
No downside to it as you see it, Dan?
None. Given that the fact that everybody else does it the same way, like what would the downside be? It's going to go a little slower, right? Because now it just can't be the mayor appoints. Now the mayor has to appoint and the Board of Aldermen have to confirm. But I actually think the benefit of the check and balance there outweighs the slowing down.
Yeah, but Dan, aren't we going to put in there a time period where the Board of Aldermen has to act?
Correct. That is correct. But nevertheless, right, like whenever there's a two-step process, it will take longer than a one-step process. That's true. That is the downside. But I think it's a minor downside. So if there's no objections, I'm going to move that into the accept column. And that will be the easiest thing we talk about tonight.
Great.
So with that, before we get into the ideas, I want to share with you guys kind of example by example what I saw out in other charters. And so bear with me as I'll show this for each of the boards and get back to our ideas. So the first one to go over, and it's going to be a boring one, is the CEO, because we've already talked about these ideas, but what I saw validates them. Just so you know, the towns that I looked at, I took the towns in Fairfield County, towns in the Naugatuck Valley, and other neighbors like Milford and interesting towns like Berlin that we have brought up to analyze. And so about 25 towns in total. What I found with the municipal CEO is pretty much so what you would expect is it's pretty evenly divided between mayors and first select. The term length of the CEO is by and large 2 years, with a couple of exceptions, usually in larger cities like Bridgeport, Fairfield, Stamford, Stratford, and Westport were the 5 with 4-year terms. And as you can see, nobody has any term limits. So we already, kind of said where we wanted to go here, but this just kind of validates it. That a 2-year term is the norm, and the norm is no term limits. Questions on that one? All right, so the legislative body. So as we turn towards our Board of Aldermen, it's very interesting as, the thing I learned is, I kept looking to see, is there one way that everybody does it? And in most cases, the answer is no. And I'll kind of put these into buckets of different legislative bodies that were created. By and large, the most common one is the kind of city council, whether they call it a board of aldermen, a city council, a town council, where there is a large amount of legislative power invested in that body. But there are other models too. There's a model that 5 towns in Connecticut have called a representative town meeting, where instead of a council, there's a much larger legislative body that is elected on the theory that it's not quite a town meeting, but neither is it a group of elected officials. It's representatives of the community. So you can see here, Darien does that with 100 people. Greenwich being the 4th largest deliberative body in the free world with 230 members of their RTM. So yeah, very large bodies here. And then the third model is really investing the legislative power in a town meeting. And so you usually see this only in smaller towns. So Easton has town meeting form, Oxford, Reading, Ridgefield, where really any ordinance or or the budget or anything else has to be passed at a town meeting. And some of the other ones like Weston and Wilton give a little more power to their boards of selectmen, but really a lot of power remains with the town. So the other things that you'll see here is, by and large, we do have one of the, so moving on to the number column, we have one of the smaller town councils, Board of Aldermen, whatever you want to call them. You can see that other valley towns are more similar to us with like 9 in Ansonia and 9 in Derby. But as you start to get to some of the larger cities, they get larger. Bridgeport is 20, Danbury is 21, Milford has 15, Buchanan has 12, right? You can see, but some larger cities like Norwalk only have 10. Stamford has probably one of the largest with 40, with the Board of Representatives 40, but Stamford's also a huge city, at least for our neck of the woods. So when you're looking at the number, we tend to be on the low side, but not outrageously so. And then on the question of minority representation, this was one where the majority of them were no, but some of them did have minority representation. So some were pretty extreme, like Danbury, where basically no more than 18 could be from one party, right? So that's, that's a pretty heavy, or very, very light, I should say, minority representation. 2 ones that are like the Milford Board of Aldermen, where they said no more than 2 per ward. So it's kind of a forced 10-5 majority or majority on Milford. Buchanan was similar. Let's see. Newtown was similar, right? So basically what you find is where there's minority representation on a town council or a board of aldermen, it tends to be 2/3, 1/3. But as I said, the majority of these don't have minority representation on it. The ones that do tend to be boards of selectmen. Boards of selectmen tend to have the minority representation on it. When it comes to term, you can see that the vast majority of these terms are 2 years. Only New Canaan and Stanford had 4-year terms for their legislative bodies. And the other thing that you know is boards of selectmen tend to be, but not always, tend to be at large, whereas town councils or board of representatives or RTMs tend to come from district. Let me stop there. I just threw a lot at you guys. Questions or comments on that?
Dan, just a note, Newtown actually has both. They have a legislative council and they also have a board of selectmen.
Ah, correct. But in their charter, they actually designate the legislative council as the legislature. So they actually use their board. This is why it's all over the place, Ruth. They use their board of selectmen as their executive. Whereas in Seymour, for example, they explicitly designate the board of selectmen as the legislature. And state statutes basically allow you to do that. They give you like 5 or 6 selections of who could be your legislature. You just have to name one of them. Other questions? If not, we can refer back to this as we look at our ideas. So that kind of gives us context. Let me go back to our ideas, and I'll present you with the ideas that we had from various sources. So, zoom in a little bit. Sorry, my computer's not responding. So the ideas on the Board of Aldermen we had, there were 3. The first one came from our public hearing, where there was the idea to have minority representation on the Board of Aldermen. And the specific idea was to either increase the number of aldermen from 8 to 12 and have no more than 2 from one party per ward, or have at-large aldermen. The second proposal was to increase the number of wards to 5 and increase the number of aldermen to 10, right? Basically saying that, hey, the city's grown, we want to keep, a more representative government, let's add an alderman. And then the third idea was to copy what they do in Danbury and Norwalk, which is to have both geographic wards and at-large aldermen. So the way Norwalk and Danbury do it is they have wards, and some of their aldermen are elected from the wards, and some of them are elected at-large from the city. So those were the ideas we had for the Board of Aldermen. And I'll just open it up, guys, based on your thoughts, based on what you've seen from other towns. Do you think any of these ideas have merit?
I'll ask a question. How would we split these into 5 wards? Would we be taking away from 2 wards? Would we redoing all the wards?
Correct. It would be the latter. You would trigger a redistricting with this that would redistrict all the wards. I think we're due for that anyway, coming up in the next 2 years. So I think we're going to redistrict no matter what, but we would redistrict into 5 wards here.
Who does the redistricting, Dan?
There's a redistricting commission that's appointed by the mayor, I believe. Gary, is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah, and I believe that they are, much like this board, forced to have both Republicans, Independents, and Democrats on it.
Hey, Don.
You're hearing the grandkids in the background?
No, not me, not me. Unusually.
All right, so does anybody have thoughts on any of these ideas?
Well, if we have to go along and redistrict anyway, do you really think we'll be 5 wards?
We can make it whatever we want. Like I'll make the argument for and against that one.
Okay.
The argument for it is, look, we've had 8 aldermen as long as I can remember, which is at least 40 years, probably longer. The city of Shelton has grown from a city of 10,000 people to a city of 40,000 people. So the argument for this is it's more representative to have more representatives on the Board of Aldermen, because each of them represents less people. The argument against this is, as we all know, as you make bodies larger, they become more unwieldy. And the more people that you have on something, the harder you conduct business. So like everything else we're going to be talking about tonight, it's a trade-off as to which you think is more important. I can tell you, but from our testimony, both the mayor and John Anglace believe that the number of aldermen we have right now is sufficient. But that doesn't mean, that's just their testimony. That doesn't mean that's what you have to do.
I think we should leave
So
it.
if we have to change the gerrymandering of the ward lines, then we may not need 5 wards because some wards would be smaller and some would be larger anyway. We could retain the 4 wards.
Well, that's not true. What has to happen is after the census, all the wards got to be equal
Okay.
population. So that's the theory behind redistricting. You have to, divide the wards up to make them equal with population. They do that with the state rep districts, state senate districts also. You take so many people and you divide it up, and it's based on a census, not voters, but on a census.
And we could create as many wards as we want. We could have 10 wards if we want.
And
Right.
and it would still be by population. It would,
It'll be by population, right? So it really is up to us, to say, well, what is that tension between, the manageability of the body versus the number of people they're representing.
Dan, for similar legislative bodies as Shelton, did you happen to compare the population counts?
Yeah, so going back, let's go back. I'll go back to the other sheet. So let's look at folks. So we got about 40,000. Let's look at people who have 40,000 to a little more, right? So if we were to look at, let's see some comparables, right? So Bridgeport's not comparable. It's got 100,000 people, right? So they have, they have 20, they're 100,000. Danbury is more in like the 70,000 range, and they have 21, right? Derby and Sonia, we know, are smaller than us. Fairfield, I mean, they have an RTM, so it's not as comparable. Milford is a little more comparable, right? Milford has about 55,000 people, so they have more than we do, and they have almost double the aldermen. New Canaan's smaller than us. They have 12 people on their town council.
No charge.
Newtown is also smaller than us. I think they're at about 25,000. They have 12 people. But then Norwalk, much larger than us, right? Norwalk's got about 65, 70,000 people, just like Danbury, and they have 10. They have 10, very similar to us. Seymour's, we know, smaller than us. Stamford, much larger than us, but they went probably to an extreme in having 40 people. Stratford, very comparable to us, right? So Stratford has about 50,000 people. We have about 40, and they have 10 council members. But Trumbull also has about 40,000 residents, and they have 21. So the short answer to your question, Ruth, is it's all over the place, right? There's no one answer that we can say, yeah, every other, like what we can definitely say is ours is on the smaller side, right? Like I don't think anybody would say we should have less, right? The question is just, should we have more?
But we're not an outlier either, so.
We are not an outlier, right? If there's a, like as you can see here, there are very few numbers smaller than 8, but there are numbers smaller than 8 here, right? And there are many that are in kind of the 8 to 10 range.
So is this something where if it's not broke, don't fix it?
I see Don shaking his head, yes.
Me too.
I see Darla shaking her head, yes. Anybody want to? Like, I'm kind of the same mindset, but I'm open to this. This is one of the ones that I see both sides of the argument on this.
I prefer more myself,
Yes.
10 or 12.
Yep. So Ruth Ann likes more.
Hey, Dan, are most of the first selectmen on there or mayors?
What's that, Gary?
Are most mayors on the legislative council also?
Yeah, most of them have most of them are the presiding officer and have a tie-breaking vote. Most of the councils have a president or a chairman, but in the event of the tie, it is the CEO who breaks the tie.
Breaks the tie, okay. But
What
if
we
it
have
was,
4 or 5, I'm sorry. Good.
because you could always have 8 and then elect the president of the board of aldermen at large.
Good. That's one of the proposals, right? You have by ward, and then you have you could add a 9th and have it be citywide. You could. So let's tackle. So I heard that Ruth Ann likes the idea of more. I heard that Don and Darlissa were saying, no, let's keep it as it is. Do you guys want to debate that, or do you want to kind of park it for now? I'm open to either.
Yeah, if I can get something straight about the wards,
Sorry, Dave?
if I get something straight about the wards,
Yeah.
whether you have 4 or 5 wards, is it true that as long as you're voting by ward, there's no state statute that mandates minority representation?
That's correct. There's no state statute at all for legislative bodies to have minority representation. Completely up to us. We could have that, but it's not mandated.
Okay.
Let me ask, if we go to 5, when we redistrict, we go to 5 wards, will we automatically go to 10 or not necessarily?
Not
2 per
necessarily.
ward.
You could
Okay.
you could actually have, if you wanted, you could have 3 per ward, right? You can go to you go 3 per ward, 5 wards. You can have 15 aldermen, right? Like it's
Okay.
completely up to us to shape. And so I think, to me, I'm like 15 is too many, right? I wouldn't want to go to 15, right? But like, to me, the question is, like, so I'm in the middle of what you guys are saying, like that, like I actually see an argument to have more aldermen based on our population. I also see the argument that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Like
I agree.
so I see both.
Dan, I have a suggestion. I would like John Anglace to come before this committee before I made a decision. I'd like to ask John some questions.
I will certainly ask him if he is willing to come. On this one, he's on record. I believe in his testimony is saying it's not necessary, but I'm more than glad to invite him. He had pushed back on doing this virtually. He had said he wanted to come in when we were meeting live again. But given the fact that that is indefinite, for lack of a better word, I will once again invite him.
Okay.
Dan, what is the current situation with our wards? Are they pretty equally populated, or aren't some much larger than others?
So geographically, they are. Based on population, they were in balance in 2012, I believe it was the last time we did this. Now they may not be. Now they may be out of balance. I don't know, because of population shifts.
But we're just creating 4 wards, and then the new committee would create the boundaries after the census.
That's correct.
If we stayed with the 4 wards.
That's right.
If we stay with 4 or 5, whatever it is, they're all would have to be drawn equally with population.
Another option would be to do 2 at large, right? And skip creating a new
And 2 at large, yeah, that's it.
additional ward. Right.
Yeah.
Would that be a salable thing? Would that be salable to anybody? I mean, is that a,
So let me go to political philosophy for a second, right? So
Yeah.
the purpose of having at-large aldermen would be to say that, hey, we believe that we want some aldermen who have the interest not of an area of the city, but the whole city at heart, right? The purposes of districts is to create localization. So to say in Shelton that there is somebody looking out for White Hills, there's somebody looking out for downtown, there's someone looking out for Huntington. The argument is that you would want people looking out after the best interests of the city, not a geographic area of the city. So to me, I'm like, the question of at-large aldermen is, do we need that? Do we feel there's a need on the Board of Aldermen for someone who's accountable to the whole city rather than a geographic boundary?
Does that change the need for a partisan board?
Well, I think they're 2 separate questions, right? Like, I think there's one, which is, does geography matter, right? When you have wards or districts, you're implicitly saying that we want a neighborhood to be able to point and say, there's my alderman, right? Rather than them being citywide. And the question of partisanship, whether you wanted to have minority representation or do it in a nonpartisan manner, I think is a separate question than if you wanted wards or not.
I'm curious
I guess-
about that question, though. If you had two at large, I would assume that it wouldn't matter, right? I mean, you certainly wouldn't have to have 1 and 1, right?
No, it'd be at large.
Does the statute even deal with,
That's my
Commissioner,
question, Don. Would statute dictate that we make it
Yeah.
minority representation because of the fact?
No.
being at-
no,
Nope, it's, sorry, Ruth, I misunderstood your question. No, state statute explicitly says that your legislative body does not need minority representation. The only place,
Regardless of how it's structured.
regardless of how it's structured, that is
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
But you're allowed to put in minority representation if you want, it's optional.
I still like to park it just temporarily.
Yep. Let me ask the one question just on the first one. I just want to see if there's any appetite for the first one. So we've said, yep, we want to, let's park number 2 and number 3. Number 1 here, the idea of having minority representation on the Board of Aldermen. Did people want to chat about that, or are people interested in that idea, or no?
No,
No,
the
No.
voice should be heard.
no, nor am I.
Okay, I'm not hearing anybody say yes. So let's take this one off the table. I'm in agreement. I don't think it's appropriate on our legislative body. So let's put reject on that one. The other 2, we're going to hold. We'll bring John in to talk to him. And if there's any other research you guys want me to do, I mean, I think you've seen it's kind of all over the place, but I'm more than glad if you guys have specific questions, I can do more research.
I'd be interested in, if again, for me, 8, it works, but if we were going to increase it, I think off the top, I'd be favored going toward an at-large, and then I'd be curious about how those candidates would be selected. In other words, if you could have an independent petition process outside of the party structure, perhaps, or,
Well, 2 things, Don, Gary, just before we go, what I'll do is for the 2 cities in the area that do this, Norwalk and Danbury, I'll actually do a deeper dive into how they do the mixed wards and at large. And to your second point around the independent petition, that's allowed today at the ward level. I think you have to get 5% of the signatures of the people in your ward, and then you're placed on the ballot. And I believe it's the same for at large. It would just be you have to get 5% of the city, not just the ward. Sorry, Gary, you were going to say something?
No, I'm all set.
What's that?
No, I mean, what I was thinking, if you went to 9, you would elect the president of the Board of Aldermen at large.
Yep, you could do that. You would end up on the ballot with a mayor, then a president of the Board of Aldermen, and then your 2 aldermen.
Then you do alderman.
So that's how it would look on the ballot then?
Yep.
For people to vote for. And could the at-large be somebody on the board already, or who's running for the board?
You probably, yeah, so the at-large, so it depends on how you do it again, right? So you wouldn't be running both in a ward and at-large, you'd run for one or the other. And I can tell you the way that Danbury and Norwalk do it is they stagger it. So I believe that the term I believe they do it so that it's in alternating years. I have to go back and double check, make sure I'm right in saying that. So I don't think all the aldermen elected at once, but I'll go, let me go back and deep dive on that, because that's if there's interest in that model, let's get a good understanding of it.
I think that would probably confuse the voting public. Simple is better.
Definitely different. All right, so let's park these 2. I'm going to invite John, and I will do more research into Danbury and Norwalk. All right, Board of Ed. Before we go to our Board of Ed ideas, let me show you. Share my PowerPoint screen. So Board of Education, as you can imagine, there are a little less degrees of freedom here. And so there are more similarities than differences. What you see generally is the term, or first off, the size tends to be between 7 and 11. right? There's a few outliers like Easton is 6 and Greenwich is 8, right? Which I don't like the even numbered boards, but most of them, as you can see, are either 7 or 9, with I think just Danbury being 11 and Milford being 10. So generally they're in that range for size. We're kind of right in the middle with 9. Term-wise, you actually see that, again, the terms are a little all over the board, with the most popular being 4 years. So there's a large number of 2s. There are a couple that do 3-year terms. Easton does a 6-year term, which is too long. But as you can see, most of them, most of these are in the 4 range, right? So we are on the minority side in having a 2-year term. The question of the hour, right, around minority representation gives, it's so funny. I was like, my guess was it was going to be half and half, and it was half and half almost exactly. Half the towns treat minority representation as even +1, which would mean for us a 5-4 split. The other half go to the recommended guidelines from the state statute, which is a 6-3 board. And funny enough, forgive me for riffing for a second, a good number of these charters actually write in one way or the other. They actually don't go board by board. They actually say for all elected boards, it shall be a bare majority +1, which is the maximum from any party. And others actually copy the statute in that Gary had shown us from the OLR report, and they just copy that in and say this shall be the maximum from each party. So, and I won't go through one at a time, but it's almost half and half. And I'd like to say there's a pattern to it, but there's not. It's kind of like every town has made its own unique decision for themselves. The one thing that is pretty consistent though is if you have a 4-year term, you're not electing everybody the same year. You're alternating, right? When you're typically alternating as close to half and half as you can get. Now, the one outlier here that I wanted to point out, just because it was one of the ideas, and it's one that I was surprised that a town followed, because I hadn't heard of this before, is Milford. And Milford actually elects their Board of Ed by wards. They have 5 wards there, and they have 2 per ward. So they have, again, by state statute, no minority representation there. And the result of which being is they have a 9-1 board, right? So, again, a model that doesn't require minority representation and maybe predictably doesn't have minority representation.
Dan, could you put Norwalk up?
Yeah. Let's go down to Norwalk. Yep. Thank you, Gary. So Norwalk was the same way. Thank you for pointing that out. Norwalk had 4 elected at large and 5 from the districts. And so they have no minority representation. Why? Because the majority of their reps are elected from the district. And so if the majority of your reps are elected from the district, the need for minority representation goes away.
Okay.
So again, an outlier. And you'll see a couple of these with question marks just because I couldn't tell. I don't want to cast aspersions on some of these charters, but some of them were not written in the best way. So I couldn't actually tell what it was. I plan on calling the boards of eds once they're reopened to ask them. So given that, one other thing to talk about, which is Berlin, which Don had brought up, and I wanted to do a deep dive here because it's a unique model, but not so unique that it's unique to Berlin. The RTM in Darien and Westport also follow this model for their legislative bodies. So in Berlin, you have 9 members who are elected with no party affiliation. They're staggered terms. They're elected for 3 years. So 3 get elected every 3 years. To get nominated for the board, you got to go out and gather signatures from 1% of the registered voters. And then the voting, and I think we showed a ballot of this, is they appear on the line below the Republicans and Democrats, and that line is untitled. It doesn't say an affiliate, doesn't say independent, says nothing. It just has 9 Board of Ed candidates who appear in random order. So that's the Berlin method of doing this. So, questions on all this?
Personally, look, after reading your report, I kind of like the Norwalk proposal.
The some
I
at
mean-
large and some from districts?
Yeah, I mean, if you kept it that way, it'd be 5 at large and 1 per ward. In what I'm looking for, it's kind of the representative democracy. I feel pretty strongly that the public should decide who's going to be on their ticket. I think the 1 per ward kind of, helps with that a little bit, right? There you could have that representative who'd be looking out for their school type of thing, for Elizabeth Shelton to make, for an argument, or Sunnyside, 1 per ward, and then let 5, let 5 happen, with the whole town.
Just
And I think that's kind of an interesting way of doing it.
before other people react, just so you know, Gare, going 5 at large and 4 by the ward would trigger minority representation, because now you have the majority of the reps being elected at large. Don't know if that influences your opinion, but that's what would happen.
Not according to Norwalk.
Norwalk has the majority. Norwalk has 5 from the districts and 4 at large. For us, if
Okay, I got it.
5 at large, right? So this starts to tie in with the previous conversation, right? So if you had 5 wards, then yep, it'd be exactly the same. If it's 4 wards, it would trigger minority representation.
And then, okay.
So for example, if you had, let's say you had 4 wards and all 4 wards elected a member of the same party, then the at-large people would be forced to be 4 and 1. Right?
So if we go to 5 wards with the alderman, we could do that. Then that would make,
That is
I
right.
get I get you.
So reaction to Gary's idea or other ideas. Well, let me just share with you guys all the other ideas that we had before we go there. Let me see, where's my screen? Share this. All right, so here's all the ideas we had on the Board of Ed. We had do like Berlin, right, was the first one. No parties listed. Second one was like half of the towns that we have seen and go to 6 members. The third was, so now we're getting into some funky things that say do like Milford does. Board of Education should be elected by ward with 2 from each ward. Then there was one that said go to ward, but have minority representation, right? They're going to go up to 12, which is a pretty big board. Then there were ideas for staggering the terms, right? So going from 2 years to 4 years staggered. And then there was one idea that you should only be able to choose up to a certain number of candidates for the Board of Education rather than up to 9. I had a note here, Garrett, to check with state statute. This actually is allowed. Other towns do limit the number of candidates you can vote for the Board of Ed to less than the number that are on the ballot.
Right. I got another question.
Yep.
Would be to get on the ballot, right? Does that have to be by state statute, or can we determine that, how to get on a ballot?
Good question, right? Because the question is like, so Berlin, this is where we're going to need a lawyer. So the standard is 5%, right? The standard by state statute, you need 5% of the signatures of registered voters within your district to get on the ballot, whether your district's a whole town or a ward. But Berlin, it says 1%, right? So it's a much lower threshold. So I don't know, right? Like, so I don't know the answer to your question. I think we got to get somebody with a keener legal mind than I to look at that.
I mean, because if you looked at it if you're doing it at large, and you said you need 5%, that's a pretty hefty amount. That's 1,000 votes. That would take a lot of work, right? 1% in Shelton would be
400.
400.
No, it's 1% of the voters.
Oh, the voter, not the, yeah, you're right. Registered voters. So it'd be like 200.
200. That's not that big of a deal.
Right. And this is why it probably works in Berlin. I don't know the population of Berlin, but I got to imagine it's less than 10,000. So you're looking at a very low bar in Berlin for it to get on the ballot.
And you didn't talk to anybody in Berlin, did you? Yeah.
I did not. I just looked at their charter.
Yeah, I'd love to know if it was working, I don't like the ward idea with Board of Ed. I think it's the wrong direction. And I think you'd be competing for resources and it would just be a distraction. But I do like the idea of, it may seem incongruent, but I would prefer to go to a 6-3 if it were minority representation, or I would prefer to go completely nonpartisan, which is my first preference. But if not, I would prefer to limit the minority representation to create more,
Well, then that's what I was trying to think of, like a compromise, just make it a little bit easier to get on the ballot. I mean, I guess, looking at in past, there was a third party in Shelton, what, about 10 years ago?
There's Citizens United, right, Gary? That's
United, and they did elect a couple people on the Board of Ed, I believe.
Again, I don't see the parties as an appropriate, keeper of the keys, I just think that you're going to get over time. I think it'd be an interesting experiment. I think you'd get some great candidates.
Yeah, so I think that the spirit that Don's speaking is right? Like, so I think my philosophy is less power to the party, more power to the voters.
Leave my phone where it was. I left it there how it was.
And I actually think any of these proposals gives more power to the people and less to the parties, right? Nonpartisan definitely does. 6 members from any one party definitely does, because now you're going to have to pick, rather than 9 of 10, you're going to pick 9 of 12. So more power to the voters. The ward system also gives more power to the voters. The one thing that sticks in my mind with the ward system, and Don hinted at it, and I'm not opposed to it yet. The only issue is it's actually something Kate Kutosh said.
My iPad?
Sorry.
That's what he thinks.
That's my grandson.
It's your grandson. Ask your grandson. Should it be 6-3 or non-partisan?
Yeah.
The issue that Kate brought up was if you go to wards, you may have trouble finding somebody to run for that ward. That's the only issue with Board of Ed. We all know Board of Ed's a huge time commitment. It's tough to get people to run. What happens if you end up that you can't find somebody to run from the 4th ward? I don't know. That's the only issue I could see.
Can't do this. And I'm going down there.
Other thoughts from other members of the board? Hey, Alyssa, please.
Historically, I don't think we've ever had a lack of interest for people to sit on the Board of Ed.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a problem.
Okay.
If we go by ward, we will get people. I don't think that is a problem at all. I definitely think we have to do something about the 5-4 because you can't get 2/3 of the vote. So that has to definitely change.
And
I'm open to the at-large. I got to think about that a little more because I wasn't sure how that would work. And tonight you explained about that. And I have to, weigh that, what's the pluses and the minuses against the system that we have now. And if we went to 6-3, I think that could be advantageous more so than the other way. So I'm listening to all sides, but I definitely know there would be no problem finding people who want to run for the Board of Ed. And I definitely agree with, I think it was Don who said we would get some interesting qualified people. I agree with him. And I know we have to fix that 5-4 does not work when you need a majority vote. It doesn't work.
The 5-4 doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be 5-4.
No, I know.
I mean 6-3. It could go 5-4.
It could
go 5-4, or it doesn't really matter. My thing is you want the public to decide. And
Right.
in a landslide election, if it was going one party or the other, is it fair that a small minority picks over 40-45% of the board? Is my message.
No, I agree with you, Gary.
I agree.
Yeah,
That's what I don't like.
Now, let me call on the 3 members who haven't spoken yet. Ruth Ann, Ruth, and Dave. In that order, what do you guys think?
Well, excuse me. I think it should be a nonpartisan. I think that there should be no party affiliation. I like the at-large vote as opposed to voting by ward. And I like staggered terms too. We didn't really get into that, but I do like that.
Yeah. Which would increase it to 4 years, right? The
Yes,
statute would increase-
yes.
Ruth, what's your opinion?
Well, I see both ways, but I don't think the ward situation would work. I just think it's too restrained for an individual to run for a specific school district, if you will. I'm not sure that the non-party would work here as well, because most people that run on some sort of platform. So you're either fiscally conservative or it's going to come out. So it's never going to be truly that your party is going to be withheld. It's just, I just don't think it's practical. So I'm in agreement with Don that the ward's not going to work. It's interesting to note that Milford, although they do it that, all of their elected boards are by ward. So they're planning and zoning, they're board of ed. So it's kind of across the board for Milford. Obviously seems to work for them. I think it's one party control in Milford for sure. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm not feeling really strongly either way, but I just don't see how the no party affiliation would work there.
Dave, what's your opinion?
I agree with not doing it by ward. I also thought that a good argument was made for going to a 4-year staggered term based upon the continuity of the business they were conducting at the time.
Yep, and that's definitely the most common thing that we see around.
Yeah.
The one argument I'll make, so this is the argument that, and again, I'm open to all of these. I see the pluses and minuses. Here's my worry about nonpartisan, and it goes off something that Ruth said. And this is where I think Don's suggestion of calling somebody in Berlin and finding out how it actually works well. So I could very easily see, based off of the last Board of Education election, right? I'm being very practical here, that you have a flyer that said, so everybody gets on the ballot, right? And the Republicans and the Democrats both nominate, they make sure that their people get out there and get on the ballot. And then both of the mayoral candidates send out flyers with, here's, Don Sheehy and Ruth Parkins, who are both running for mayor, and here's their people. Bring this to the polls and vote for Ruth or vote for Don and vote for their people. So it inherently becomes partisan again. And my issue is you get rid of minority representation, right? Like my issue is what I don't want in Shelton is to have a 9-0 board. I don't think that is conducive, right? Even if there's no R's or D's next to their name, if in reality it's 9 R's or it's 9 D's, I don't think that's conducive to us. So that's my only worry with nonpartisan. It's the law of unintended consequences, is if by going nonpartisan, do we end up with a more partisan board? Like other politicians out there. Don't know, right? But that's my worry there.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Don's suggestion is right. Let's see how it actually works, right? I just read the charter. Let's call them and be like, hey, how did your last election go? Like, I don't know if anybody knows anybody up in Berlin. I can pull some.
I know somebody up there. I know somebody that's on the board of, I guess, selectman. He's a Democrat. Who's a former rep.
Yeah, could you call him, Gare? Like that'd be good. You can give us like the inside scoop of, hey, did this work as you guys intended, or were there unintended consequences? Because to me, that's the 64th.
The argument you just made is actually the argument that killed it in Greenwich. Went right to the wire.
Yeah,
but they felt exactly the way you just expressed it. I guess my only thought is at least it takes some judgment. At least it takes some judgment. Whereas now you can simply go across and just already XXXXXXX.
Right, some thought might be put into it.
Yeah.
Or for the uninformed voter, right? If there's a voter that's getting out there that has no idea, has not listened to any politics, has not read any of the flyers that have been sent out, is an independent, so he wouldn't be getting either of the party mailings. If, you know, it's possible they could go and just select based on name. So, but I think that would definitely be a minority population.
Right. The thing I do feel, just expressing my own opinion, is, you know, there's a, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We said on the alderman, something needs to change here, right? To get a better, more cohesive, less political system going on at the Board of Ed. And so I'm open to any and all of these ideas, you know, except for number 4 is the one that I'm like, I don't want to go to a board of 12, right? I think 9 works, 12 is too big. But almost any of these other ideas, I think, are viable ideas that we can consider. So,
I mean, there's no lever. It's all paper ballot, Dan. You know, maybe compromise a little is to make it a little bit easier to get on the ballot.
yeah, if that's possible, that's what I want to look into too, is how, if in Berlin they can get away with 1% and the standard's 5%, how'd they do that, right? Like, is that allowed in state statute that you can set a lower threshold?
It goes back to the court case. It's local rule.
It's local rule, but it also might be explicitly allowed. I don't know. I haven't read every single state statute. It's a good question though. Yeah.
And I also think we got 2 pretty different stories from Kutash and from Jimmy Orizetti regarding the 2/3 majority needed for policy change.
Yep.
And I was just wondering what Darlissa's take was on that.
Good question, Dave.
I agree with what Jimmy explained to you, because that's what I witnessed with my time being on the board. Kate was right in that there really has never been, we've had some heated discussions at policy, but when all came down to the end, everybody voted for the best interest of the system and the kids. So, you know, policy kind of worked itself out. If you have, you know, people who are concerned about the kids, if your ideas are sensible, you know, I have not witnessed any arguments by party line for that, but our book
That would make perfect sense to me, what you're saying. But it just sounded like we had, when Kate spoke, it sounded like very good. When Jimmy spoke, it sounded like it was very contentious.
Well, sometimes it could be during discussion, but that's when you want the contentiousness to come out so everybody could air their grievances and share their logic. So, you know, yes, there is contention sometimes, but in the end, it always has worked out. And that's with 2 different groups of board people, so.
Right.
So it seems like, gang, unless, can I just, because I like putting rejects on ones that we're really not discussing. If we could put a reject next to the expand to 12 and elect by ward, does anyone want to make an argument for that one?
Yes, I agree with that.
So the first 3 are kind of like 3 mutually exclusive ideas, right? We got to pick
Yes.
one of them, right? So it's either nonpartisan, go to a maximum of 6, or go to some mixture of ward and at large, right? The original idea was 2 from each ward. Gary had said 1 and do the rest at large, right? So 3 different ideas, we got to pick one. Then almost independently, no matter which one of those 3 you pick, you could extend the Board of Education to a 4-year term and do it staggered. And I know that different members have had different opinions of a 4-year versus a 2-year term. What do you guys think, regardless of how we structure it, right? I heard Ruth Ann said she liked 4 years. What are other opinions on 2 versus 4 years?
Well, originally I thought maybe 4 years would be good, but then I was doing my own research and contacting, you know, retired teachers that are all over the state. And in Bridgeport, if you get somebody on who is extremely vindictive, outwardly outspoken in a bad way, you're stuck with them for 4 years. And I was thinking about that, and I could see where that could be a big problem, because now they're never going to agree to anything, and you have them always saying no for 4 years. How can you move forward? You know, Bridgeport had some members removed physically from security. So that kind of, you know, that made me think about the 4-year term thing a little differently, because originally I thought maybe that would be good because of the planning that you do on the Board of Ed. However, the people, again, their vote should count. If you are doing the right planning and if they like you, they will vote you back in to finish the job. So
Excellent.
I'm open to other people's opinions, but
One of the arguments for the 4-year term is to maintain continuity. And I know we're addressing the same exact issue on planning for the Planning and Zoning Commission, right? We currently have 4-year staggered terms, looking at potentially dropping it down to 2 years, because the 4 years, like Darlissa mentioned, you can sometimes get a member that, as with any board, you can get a member that's really just vindictive or just not in it for the right reasons. So you know, if we could go to a 2-year staggered term, the same that we may decide to go with planning and zoning, I think that would address the issue of continuity, because you'd always, but you can't do that with 2 years, because every 2 years is an election. So
Well, you actually could, Ruth. You would just do it in even number years, right? You would just have, if you wanted to stagger it with a 2-year term, you'd elect half the board in 2021 and the other half in 2022, right? So some would be on with the governor. Or the
I guess it's in, how would you initiate that though? If you think about it, how do you initiate it?
Yeah, so so just addressing that question, or just to let you know, it is possible. It's other towns, they wrote the transition in their charter, especially those who went to 3-year terms, right? So you saw on the Board of Ed, a couple of people did it with 3-year terms, planning and zonings with 3-year terms. They basically do a transition where like one member selected at large has to be up for, you know, the 2021 cycle, then another one for the 2022 cycle, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you have 3-year terms, you're going to be in both odd and even numbered years. So so again, just to say, we could do whatever we want. We could separate the question of staggered versus 4 years if we wanted. Most Board of Ed who are staggered are also 4 years.
Isn't P and Z 4-year terms 2-year staggered now?
Correct.
Yes.
It is. Okay, so, okay.
That was only changed about 8 years ago, maybe. It used to be just 2-year terms.
See, that's where I get into, you know, the idea that some of these boards just have different set of needs. On P and Z, if somebody's gonna have any skin in the game over time, they've got to be on it for longer than 2 years. You know, a big application will take more than 2 years. So, I mean, I like the idea of somebody actually being held accountable over time to account for what they do. And I think the 4-year on the P and Z is good, and I think the staggered terms are good. Whereas with the Board of Ed, if the Board of Ed went to 4, then you got to deal with a board of aldermen and a mayor who are on 2-year terms. I think that's.
and you know what else, Don, excuse me, you have to deal with the exit of superintendents. And so 4 years, you could have 2 different superintendents. You would want a new person on to give the new superintendent a fair shake. You know, 4 years could hinder that because they're carrying over baggage from the previous superintendent.
I agree.
If you get, you know, it could happen.
I like to talk about a 2-year term. I mean, in planning and zoning, and Ruth could expand upon this. I guess a few years back, the Republicans put up a gentleman who got elected and basically said that he was against voting for anything. He didn't believe in zoning. And he could have been on there for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, eventually he resigned, and I mean, it could have been a major problem.
Fortunately, he was an alternate.
But yeah, you know, he probably wasn't vetted the proper way. And even with the Board of Ed, I think, you know, everybody says, if it's not broke, it's not, you know, don't fix it if it's not broken. You know, our aldermen and our Board of Education are suing each other. So I'm not sure that's working.
No, I agree with that.
So it's broke is what you're saying.
I'm saying it's broken.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So if the public decides, hey, we got all these people, they're not working together, we're going to put people in that are going to work together. Is that wrong?
Yeah, so this is you guys are citing the classic trade-off, right? Which is, look, there's an argument, there's no right answer. It's an argument
Right.
each way, right? So the argument for 2-year terms is clear. It's more power to the voters, right? It is voters will be able to remove bad apples. Voters can change direction if they want. And, it maximizes power to the voters. 4-year term maximizes for expertise, right? It actually says, look, you allow somebody to learn the job, to develop an expertise, whether it's in zoning or on Board of Education, and to really, really get deep in the issues and be knowledgeable about it without a higher risk of turnover. It's just a trade-off, right? I always reserve my opinion to last. I wanted everybody express an opinion. Dave, did you express an opinion?
I did.
Good. So everybody expressed an opinion. I fall on, so on that spectrum, I fall on maximize power of the voters. They are both valuable. I would not go, if all 6 of you said you wanted a 4-year term, I wouldn't fight you on it, right? But if you ask me, I want to give more power to the voters over the expertise that you develop with a 4-year. Just where I am, but I see the other side of the argument on that.
But with staggered terms?
I would want to go just 2 years, no staggered terms.
Is this Board of Ed you're talking about?
I would actually make it for the Board of Planning and Zoning as well. I think the question with planning and zoning is is a legal question of can you do that, right? Because I think that's what we went back and forth on 8 years ago, is do we need to have 4-year terms? But if we can, my opinion is maximize power to the voters.
Here's my argument with that, okay? And particularly as it pertains to land use, to planning. I think planning and zoning is a very sophisticated thing. And I think that, you can talk about administrative functions, budgeting and all the rest of it, but there's a lot to the land use. In fact, it could be bolstered. We should have an architectural review committee that serves as an advisory role to P&Z to try to guide a lot of this money that's being spent on buildings that really aren't architecturally compatible. I mean, you could build it more rather than try to take from it. If you have guys in there for 2 years and a guy comes in with an application and it gets hung up, they could literally not be able to finish the application. There's always going to be some rollover at the end of the term, but at least somebody, and there's also an element of accountability there. They make a bad decision and then they get to live with it. They get to live with it and see that, that wasn't a good one. So anyway.
This is where everything you just said, Don, is correct. Right. That's why this is ultimately a trade-off and a judgment call we have to make. Right. And so, and it might be different for different boards. It might be different for different boards.
Yeah. I think it is.
So
that's an interesting thing on the review committee, the architectural review committee. I know it's not the right time to bring up something, but I was talking to John Angles. And he had an idea about another board, which the town, with education and what's going on, where we spend a lot of money on technology or we don't. And we were talking about the possibility of even maybe putting in there for another committee, like a technology committee. So somebody could kind of review what's going on and make recommendations to the Board of Aldermen.
I think Shelton could benefit from an architectural review to myself, because I think the planning and zoning, they're so busy and they spend way too much time dealing with things like signage and, building design. And I think that would lend itself to be helpful.
So those are both interesting ideas I want to put in our list, right? So we actually haven't, one of the areas that we didn't go deep on is, do we have the right set of appointed committees, right? There were no ideas to really change the appointed committees, right? So we just kind of didn't address it. But those are two interesting ideas with the technology committee and architectural review committee that you could have in addition to the ones that we currently have in charter.
Let's add those and look into them.
Yep, going to do that.
I think they could be beneficial.
Yeah. Both of them seem to have merit.
Yes.
Good. So on this one, so my sense is on, numbers 1 through 3, what I heard was that most people are open to one Most people are open to 2. 3 was a little more divisive, right? I heard some people in favor of wards, against wards. On 5, I think we're all over the place. I heard some people with 4, some people with 2. And then on 6, what are people's opinion? 4 was a reject. And on 6, like, what about this idea that, so right now you are allowed to vote for up to 9 candidates, right? And so, you have, typically at least, 10 candidates on the ballot, and you can vote up to 9. One of the things, I think, Gary, this was your idea, was to say, hey, in order to make this more choiceful for voters, right? And actually to give voters more power, do you actually restrict the number of votes that people have, right? To say, look, you got to be more choiceful than that. You have to vote for any 5, right? Or 6, or whatever the number is. Other towns do that, right? So I was like, oh, is that legal? Is that allowed? Other towns actually do restrict you to a number of votes that's actually lower than the number of candidates who can win. So don't know if it's advisable, but it is possible.
I think that stops the games that are played. And I think it's a good idea.
Other folks.
Well, on 6, you said you were going to.
I tend to agree with that. Go ahead, Darlissa.
I was going to say, I would like to choose up to 6. I don't know.
Yeah, then you would say you vote for 6.
Yeah.
If that's what you're putting up. It's like, the way it works, if you use the example, which it was, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7 times over the last 20 years, where both parties put up 5 candidates, right? And then you could vote for 9. So you basically,
vote for everybody.
For everybody. This way, if you're choosing 5, you could, split the votes and from one party to another, and then the balance, the minority is gonna, will come out. The top of the minority votes come out.
Well, then it wouldn't be any different than it is now.
It is a difference.
Well,
How is it different?
Well, if you're sitting there and you're going to vote Republican for argument's sake, then the Republican is picking which Democrats they want on the board also.
Correct.
It would seem like it would just accentuate the disparity and just create more bad feelings about having those Democratic candidates on the board.
I'm not against minority representation on there. I just don't think it's fair when one person gets 6,000 votes and loses, when another person gets 2,000 votes and wins.
Yeah, but I think, Gary, the argument for this, right? I'll make the argument for it and against it. The argument for it is the one you just made, which is, look, if you believe we're not doing number 1, right? So if we're not in a nonpartisan world, people are still Republicans and Democrats. You don't want people bullet voting for members of the opposite party who agree with them, right? So if you don't want to be a Republican saying, oh, here's a Democrat I really like, I'm going to bullet vote for them so I get 9 votes, or vice versa. As a Democrat, here's a Republican I really like, I'm going to bullet vote for them. But by restricting it to 5, you could still do that, but you just can't vote for all the Republicans and the one Democrat you like, or vice versa.
That's correct.
That's the argument you're making. Got it.
But what'll happen is with the party, somebody will go and tick their 6 Republicans off, and then there won't be any other votes.
Correct.
So the disparity between the Republican, but now you'll have those leading candidates with 6 and 5,800 and 5,900, and then you're going to have 2,000, 1,900, 1,700, and now the whole image of that minority representation is diminished. Because
but it kind of shows them. I think what happens, Don, is if you're sitting there and if I have 5 Republican votes, then I'm going to vote for the 2 Democrats I may agree with. And so the Republican is really picking the Democrat. And I'm not sure that's correct. It's kind of hard to show everybody on Zoom. If we were, sitting here, I could show you a bunch of ballots on how you would do it. And I think you play games. You play games with the bullet voting, and that's what I'm against.
And what happens if they fill in 6 slots, even though they only have 5? It throws the whole ballot out, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Throw the whole ballot out. And that's the question in my mind is, how many people, so Don and Gary just laid out 2 different types of behavior. And the truth is we're not going to know which one is predominant, but my guess is both exist, right? There are some people who are just going to vote party line, right? And they're like, oh, I got 5 votes. I got 5 slots. I'm just going to vote for the 5 R's or the 5 D's. And then there are other people, to Gary's point, who maybe are a little more in the know. Maybe they know some of these people and they're going to play games with that. Don't know which one of those models is predominant in the voters, but I think they're both out there.
But you don't take that chance if you're only voting for 5 or 6 or whatever we limit to. When you allow it to vote for 9, then you're able to play.
That is true.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
That is true.
Yeah.
So let's park this one for now. With this one, let me do this. Let me come back with the language from some of the towns that do this, and you can have a look at how other towns have managed this and what their charters. And then you guys can determine whether or not you like this one. I see merit to this one. Again, I'm not wedded to it, but I see merit in this one.
Dan, and I think, if we're going to, stick with the state guidelines, then let's stick with them.
Yep. All right. So Board of Ed. So as I expected, I thought it would be a miracle if we came to consensus tonight, but we at least started to narrow it down. At least rejecting a couple ideas here, one idea. And so let's move on just to Board of Planning and Zoning, where here the ideas we had is one is to move P&Z from 6 members to an odd number, either 5 or 7, and then 2-term things, basically to bring P&Z and the alternates into line with each other, either make P&Z alternates 4 years or make P&Z regular members into 2 years. Let me show you guys a little bit about before we dive into it, let me show you what I found in other towns. So other towns I'm planning. What you find is size is by right now.
You're going on your computer?
No. Good night, honey. Sorry.
Okay. We have, ranging from as little as 5 in towns like Antonia and Greenwich to as large as 10 in Milford, whereas we said we did 2 per ward. Some of the towns you'll see like Norwalk and Stratford break out the planning and zoning boards, separate those responsibilities. But you can see, like, in general, right? In general, it is a 4-year term with some weird terms like 5-year terms and 3-year terms thrown in. But I don't know if there are terms out there, right? So again, you might be like, okay, I don't know if it's legally required if some people are doing 2-year terms with at-large elected bodies. But 4 is the norm. And when it comes to minority representation, much like the Board of Education, it's kind of split down the middle between those who do, the majority +1, like a Newtown, or like Bridgeport, Danbury, Fairfield, and Greenwich all go to the allowable maximum. The other interesting thing, which I'm sure is you don't have to elect your planning and zoning board, is you can actually appoint them. So there's actually a number of these boards that aren't elected, but are actually appointed by their CEO and legislative body. So kind of with that, any questions on that or any, Ruth, you want to add any flavor on your experience?
I'm not sure appointed would go over.
No.
Yeah, I'm not,
I agree.
no,
I agree.
I don't think the charter revision would pass.
I would vote for it. So with that, what do people think about like changing the number of members to an odd number? The thing, and by the way, the thing I didn't do, Ruth, if you had asked for this, I still have to do this, is an analysis of how other towns treat alternates. I can tell you that most towns have alternates, but not all. And I gotta create a sheet like this for alternates, just like I did for regular members.
Okay, I'll go first. I would prefer 7 over to 5. And then I would like, if we're going to keep the alternate, I would like it elected. So maybe 1 alternate, because we right now have 6 and 2, so it's still the same amount of people. I like to hear more of the debate between a 2- and 4-year term and how that would work out. Minority representation would be under state guidelines. And then then we determine how many you could vote for. That would be my recommendation.
What's the purpose of an alternate?
Conflict of interest.
And or to sit in if there's a member absent, so that you
But
basically
in
always
lieu
have a.
in lieu of a member, I mean, is what's
In lieu of a member. My understanding, because it's a separate debate, is whether we're going to allow virtual meetings and virtual votes. Right? Isn't that was mentioned? Some people mentioned we should have it. Some people have mentioned that we should not.
I guess my question is why an alternate? Why not just make the committee larger and get alternates? What's the downside? I guess I really don't understand it.
It probably isn't at the downside. Yeah, and then what would a quorum be? Right? So if 2 people didn't show up, it's simple majority wins.
I think it depends what you're voting on by state statute too, Gary. If it's a land use matter, if it's a rezone, there has to be a larger quorum.
A quorum.
Yeah, it's not like a simple vote for a sign approval or something.
Right. Okay. Well, then then that's the purpose.
And I think that's where state statute would come into play on that, having a quorum for those types of votes. I personally really never saw the purpose of the alternates, except that they are able to sit in, and some towns treat alternates differently in that, in our case, if the alternate is a Democrat and there's a Republican missing, you can have him sit in. That's how our charter's written. In other towns, they only allow them to sit in if their own party is missing.
Same party.
I would be more in favor of adding and eliminating the alternates altogether.
So just go to 7.
Yeah, because basically the alternates are appointed. They're not elected.
Right. I agree.
I agree too.
I agree. I like the larger number. I like to go to 7.
Mhm.
Okay, I actually agree as well.
Yay, we got an accept on that one.
Next, go to 7 and eliminate alternates.
But with a 5-2 party representation.
It's whatever it is. We're going to stick with the stick with the state recommendation.
Mhm.
Well, that can be all, you can take your pick on that.
Well, no, I guess it recommends 5, no more than 5.
Right, no more than 5.
So there's minority representation. That's really what it is today.
4-2.
4-2. So you're just, it doesn't mean that the Democrats right now it's 4-2, but the Democrats could win. I mean, then the public's deciding who they're electing. And I think I just like to keep it consistent.
Mhm.
Does everybody comfortable with that? That would inherently say, of course, idea 2 is rejected because there wouldn't be people. That's-
Yes,
Oh, would be no alternate. Yes.
Everyone comfortable with that?
yes.
We still need that verified by an attorney, though.
What, that's, no, to go with a 4-year term?
To
No, for
take
the
4-year term.
alternates.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, so we're not at the 4-year term yet. All we said so far is we're gonna go to 7,
Right,
no
Mhm.
more than 5 from one political party, eliminate the alternates.
correct.
Right.
oh, I'm sorry, P and Z alternates. Okay, alternatives. Got it.
Yep. What did I write
And
down?
then we have to decide on the 4-year.
Ugh.
Don, would you have a problem with, going 2 years if we were able to put in that architectural review committee?
So I think, see, another problem I have with it, Gary, is that, these guys are coming in with large amounts of money. I mean, they're putting it on the line. These projects range from simple stuff to very complex stuff. And the idea, these projects often take over 2 years to bring home. And the idea of having, subject to the vagaries of different leadership, I think that's something you want to frustrate. I don't think that's something you want to encourage when it comes to something like this. I think it's too important. But that's my view.
You're making a valid point.
So you're for the
What do you
4-year,
think?
right,
I was going to
Don?
say, Ruth, what do you think?
I'm not opposed either way. I don't really have any strong feelings either way. I mean, for as long as I served, it didn't, I was on there 10 years. We did both. It didn't, the problem is if someone is elected that really turns out to be just not a good choice, then you're stuck with them for 4 years.
But that's rather rare than the norm.
True. My time on the board in the 10 years, there was only one individual. Unfortunately, it was an alternate, so.
Mhm.
Oh, well, yeah, no, there's
Oh.
that. Now that I think of it.
Now that you think of
I think on this one, I think there's mixed views, right? So
Mhm.
this is where, I am open to be swayed on this, right? Like, because my mind, my issue is I hear Don's arguments and I accept all of them. I think they're all valid reasons. And I still see the value of voters being able to change their minds and change direction. But I understand Don's argument as well. That's why I'm like, I could be persuaded on this one.
me too.
Well, I really like the idea of adding those 2 committees, because if they have to go through those committees first with their plans, and I know they spend a lot of money on them, then they go for the other board for 2 years. That would kind of make the 2-year people who have to make the final votes simpler to make a decision, I think, because they've gone through 2 other reviews first. Yes or no? I don't know if I'm in an area that I don't know a lot about, so whatever.
Yeah, it's not true for the technology committee. That'd be a separate thing, but I actually don't know how the architectural review committee works. Is that just, could you say a couple more words about that? Like how that would impact the process?
Sure, so that's something that would come into play after approval was granted. So if they're going for a zone change, naturally that would have to happen first. And then there would be a site plan, right? And the type of use, et cetera. And then the architectural review would come after the site plan is approved. At least that's been my experience with other towns.
Got it. With the goal of making things look consistent, making sure that the architecture going in is appropriate for the area.
Right. If you have a historic area, they're going to take a lot of historic preservation ideas into play. It can be cumbersome for a developer. I'm not going to lie, but I think it could produce a better product for Shelton residents.
And it comes after planning and zoning action. Got it.
Some towns are preemptive as well, like East Lyme. East Lyme has a simple folder with acceptable designs. It's thick. It's very thick, you know, so I mean, if you want to bring a CVS into East Lyme, it's going to look like a country store, you know, so, which is an extreme, but I mean, even if you look at the downtown and you think, geez, you know, had we preempted some of that with a few more controls, we'd probably have a better product. Although Bridgeport Avenue, you know, invisible, I mean, Bridgeport Avenue's done very well. Beautiful, I mean, for the most part. So.
Yeah, because there was no, you know, there's no historic, like, but downtown, right? There's a lot of historic buildings, so you don't want it to look like a real mishmash of architectural design. So that it would more come into play where there's districts or areas, and you know, it's a board that you can determine what their powers and authority are going to be.
But if you're
advisory, yeah, they're typically strictly advisory to the PNC.
Yes.
does it take the guessing game out of things? I mean,
No.
if you're coming in, you know, you say, okay, I'm trying this idea, and if they don't like it, you got to go back to the drawing board. Where, you know, if you had this committee, you kind of know what to expect.
It takes
an
a lot of
architect-
personal opinion out of the equation. You know, who likes red, who doesn't like red, who, you
Right.
know, who likes dog houses, who doesn't like dog houses. And that's, you know, you just start spending a lot of time on designs like that. And so that would be removed from the Planning and Zoning Commission and parlayed onto the architectural review.
But every time you make a design change, it costs money to a developer.
Yes.
So having something consistent where they could read and say, here's what the town wants, maybe makes it a little bit easier for them.
Right. And that's something that the architectural review board could work on is those guidelines. But Don's right, they would be advisory. They wouldn't have.
Right, it'd be advisory, right.
Okay, well, good. So I'm going to add that idea in. I'm going to put down mixed views on the 2 versus 4 years. We'll have more conversations about that.
But we're still back to the question of whether we can do the 2 years
Right.
without.
There's a legal question there.
Correct.
And this is where, thanks
Yeah.
for bringing me back to that, Ruth. Ruth and Ruth Ann, because you guys, you know, Ruth, because you lived it, Ruth Ann, you also lived it with the last charter revision. What's the legal issue here that we thought we had to go to 4 years?
The way I read the state statute is that it's not a can, it's a shall.
Mhm.
If you have more than 5 members, you shall have staggered terms. That's the legal question.
Good. Let me share my screen because I want to see something. So stop share. If you have more than
We're having a little technical difficulty, I think.
Oh, okay. There we go. So this is what. So let's look here because a couple of people did have not 2-year terms, right? So like, so Ansonia, right? They had a 2-year term, but they were only 5. Danbury, I'm going to go back and look at because I thought they had a 2-year term, but they have 9. And then let's see who else has a 2-year, and some people have 3-year terms,
Greenwich.
right? But they're also appointed.
Right. New Canaan as well.
Right. You can appoint it as well, right? And so then we had, Reading only has 5. And so they're able to do the 2 years. Interesting, Ruth. Yeah, so everybody who has 2-year terms has 5 members or less or is appointed. So we may have to be at 4.
We may what?
We may have to be at 4.
If we go to 7.
Right. Or even if we stayed at 6, but
Oh, okay.
I thought there were counter examples here, but there's only one here in Danbury. And so I'll go look at that. But everything here is consistent with what Ruth said, that if you have more than 5 and you're elected, you have to have more than a 2-year term.
So, I mean, and that goes to my point where it's the local control determines it. Why would they allow Danbury to do that?
Well, this is where Dan DiBasella has been known to make a mistake in the past. See if I got it right for Danbury. So if I got it right for Danbury, then yeah, what's going on there? If I got it wrong for Danbury, it might just corroborate the fact that state statute does require this.
Right, okay.
So this may be a moot point for us.
And if we're gonna stay consistent, we're gonna stay with the state guidelines or state statute, then is that what we do throughout? I'm okay with that, go that road.
Yeah, I just, we're talking about people's property here and, that whole, it's, some of the decisions can certainly impact people more than a decision on a Board of Ed would. So,
Okay,
Yeah,
we're gonna double check Danbury and state statute.
that's true.
May be moot. All right. So then the only other two that we had was on the appointed boards and the library board, right? And so I have not done an analysis on library boards. I will if you want me to. But the appointed boards, other towns, some standardize and some do not. So some have, like we do, varying terms. Others just say all appointed boards shall be 2 years, right? 2 years is the typical one if they're going to do it. New mayor or first selectman, they can appoint new people. So don't know, like that said here, hey, and I haven't done a lot of research into this, to say, hey, is there a logic to why there are different term lengths? And, the feeling of the board when we first talked about this was, in the absence of a good reason to have different term lengths, let's standardize. But if there's a good reason, then okay. So that was kind of where we left it off.
So, with the library board and the 6-year term. So the library board's a little unusual because they control their money. And they've also got this ability in terms of endowments. It seems like there could be a reason that and it's also not I can't believe it's a political issue. Is it?
No.
Is it?
I wouldn't think so.
I'm thinking that's just better left alone.
I agree. I mean, it's a library. I mean, it can't be political. Shouldn't be political.
Anybody feel we should reduce it?
have we asked anybody on the library board what they think?
Good question. We have not.
How many are
Wonder
on the
if they think
library
it's-
board again?
I'm just not sure 6 years is the right term.
There's six members.
Right.
There's
But again, they are distinctly different in that they control their money.
They are different, and it is unique that it's elected as well, right? Like we have other boards that you can make an argument like a schools board that are elected in other towns. The elected library board is a relatively unique thing in Shelton, right? And de facto, by the way, this is appointment by parties, right? Like there really isn't a competitive library board.
They're staggered though, right?
They are staggered. They are staggered.
So if we're gonna have appointments for 4 years, why don't we just reduce it to 4, from 6 to 4? That's still a long time.
I wouldn't go to 2, but I would be open to go to 4.
I agree with 4 also.
And should they be elected? Like, I'm asking the question without an opinion, but like, should we elect library board members or should we just appoint?
I don't see the importance of electing them. I mean, I don't know. What could they be opposed to or for that we would not want for the library?
This is where, unlike P&Z or the Board of Education, where ideology matters, right? Like that actually matters to the direction of our zoning or of our education system. Kind of one way to run a library board. Maybe I'm being naive, right? But I don't think there's a Republican way or a Democrat way or an independent way to run a library. So I don't know. Like, to me, I'm like, maybe you make it appointed, but again, I don't feel strongly about it.
seems to me that there's a little passion involved in this. You know?
Yeah,
And it also, you know, I don't know if you want to make it subject to political appointment. I mean, it works.
yeah.
Whether it's 6 or 4, I don't know if that makes a difference, but again,
There's an argument of it's not broke, don't fix it.
yeah,
You know,
and they do a great job.
you do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, as I said, I don't feel strongly on this one, guys.
I don't either. On 6 or 4 is good, is fine by me.
This is the only board that's 6 years, correct?
Yeah. 6 years, that is correct.
Wonder what the thought was behind making it 6.
Somebody wanted to be a senator.
Who's the chair of the library board right now? Maybe we ask them.
I don't even know.
I don't know. I think it's a
I
woman,
know,
but
I know
don't
Steve
her name.
Bellis is on.
Bellis is on, Alita Minor is on, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not sure who's chairman though.
All right,
I think we should
Blakeman
ask
is
a
on.
couple of them.
ask chair of library. Board for opinion. I'll take that as a.
I would ask Steve Bellis because he was on the last 2 charters and
I was say he was on the last charter, then definitely.
That's a good
that's where
idea.
it came about, where the conversation was to make it 6 years.
I just think if we're trying to make this charter more uniform across the boards and commissions, that the 6 is just kind of like the outlier. So why wouldn't we go to 4? You know, if we're going to do 2 and 4 years on the others,
Right, and it
we're
was
considering,
it would still be
four.
staggered rather than electing 2 every election. You elect
right?
election, right? So it's still.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take away 2, right? So maybe go to 4 years. And last Steve, no disposition, nobody be passionate about it. How about on appointed boards? So on appointed boards, do we want to be consistent with a 2-year or a 4-year term, or is it kind of like, no, we're comfortable that there are, you know, different terms for different boards? And the thing, which as I say that I could do is I could just create a list of here are all the appointed boards and here are the terms.
In their terms, yeah, just so we could see.
What are the ZBA terms? This,
So Sophia and I figured it's by ordinance. It's not even in the charter, right, Sophia?
For ZBA,
Yeah,
yeah, it's appointed and, in fact, I think I have an email. Dan, I did send you that email from the ZBA
Yes.
I saw it.
and it was
I
the
think it's
vacancy
6.
and
is it 6?
6 years? Is that what you're
Yeah.
asking?
Yeah, what was the term? Do you recall?
I think it's 5.
5.
Yeah, which was weird.
Right. So that's what I want. I want to put together that sheet because I think you'll see there's a bunch of weird numbers on there. And the question is just like, okay, why, right? Like for Don's question, if there's a good reason why, then okay. But if it's not a good reason why, and we just have haphazard numbers because we just decided over time on different numbers, then let's standardize at 2 or 4 years, right? That's kind of my opinion. But
I agree.
I agree too.
I agree as well.
let me pull that together for us so we can look at that. So we can just see all the boards in their terms.
That's like Parks and Rec. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
Like the
Okay.
charter has about a dozen appointed boards that are out there that are appointed by charter. And so just create the list of all of those, right? And we could also decide, like, we really haven't even looked at the appointed boards. We could decide that maybe some of them don't need to be appointed by charter. Maybe they should be done by ordinance. Maybe there are other ones out there that should be done by charter, right? Being in charter basically mandates that they exist and takes away the possibility of the Board of Aldermen eliminating them. Because the Board of Aldermen create more boards and commissions if they want. They're empowered to do that. But by putting in the charter, we're saying you must have it.
the only
Well,
reason,
I
I'm
think the ZBA is required.
It is. That's what the ZBA,
Yeah.
ZBA is the only one that's out of sync, right? That's where we have a separate item. Like, I definitely want to bring whatever, if it's 5 years, I want to bring that into the charter because ZBA is a required board. And so I just want to be consistent on that.
The WPCA and the Employees Appeal Board are both 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good, guys. So a good conversation. And I think we came out in a good place, right? So just to summarize what we're doing. So we accepted the appointments on the we accepted the new way of doing board appointments of being mayor nominates, board of aldermen confirms. We rejected the minority representation idea on the board of aldermen. But in terms of either enlarging the board or adding an at-large alderman, we want to hear from President English. So I'll take it on myself to invite him in. On Board of Education, we kind of had, we want to reject it in enlarging the board, but we still have more discussion around the nonpartisan idea. So Gary's going to call his friend in Berlin to kind of get the skinny on what happens. Sounded like people were open to the 6 members, but maybe not everybody's first choice. And on the wards, sounded like some people were in favor, some people against. Same thing with Board of Education, staggered to 4 terms. I heard some people in favor, some people against. And I heard, hey, interesting idea on maybe limiting the number of votes that people get. Let's get more. Dan, go get some examples from the charter. Let's see if that's a good idea or not. P&Z, we said, yep, we're going to go to a 7-member board and we're going to eliminate alternates. And then we're going to research what appears to be the case that we are mandated to have 4-year terms. And if that's the case, idea 3 is moot. It's going to be a 4-year term. And then other ideas we just talked about, we'll call Steve Bellis to ask him his opinion on the library board. And then I'll create a sheet of all the appointed boards so we can see all their various terms and if or not we want to standardize.
Okay.
So that's where we are. And gang, what you'll find is, and I haven't gone one by one, but next meeting, I think we've talked about all the ideas once at this point. I got to make sure that that's a true statement. But next meeting, we will deal with, if there are any ideas we have not talked about in depth at least once, I'll put them on. And then what's going to start to happen is as we get this information in, we'll be able to start, debating and discussing the other items that we have punted on. So what I want to see now that we've talked about everything is there are going to be some of these that we're going to come to consensus on because we just wanted more information. There are going to be some of them that we're going to have a more vigorous debate about, right? Like tonight was just an opening on some of these, but we're making progress. So we're, this is kind of some of the toughest topics we've had to talk about. We've talked about tonight, and I think we did a good job with it. I think people made very logical arguments, both for and against different ideas. So we just keep chopping wood.
Sounds good.
Any other questions or anything else for the good of the order?
Thank you for doing all this research for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm actually, the nerd in me enjoys it a lot. So, so with that, gang, we will meet again next Monday, and same time, same channel, quite literally YouTube channel. And if there's a motion to adjourn, I will accept it.
So moved.
Motion by Darlissa, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ruth Ann. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned, gang. Have a great night.
See you next
Enjoy the
week.
week.
All right now.
Take care.
Night, guys.
Night.
Night.